Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of our 7 top reasons Paul never met the true Jesus. So, this is the final reason. And this is also one of the most strongest reasons. So, we started with a very strong reason, the Son of Man prophecy. We went to the other difficulty Paul has that his Jesus spoke to him in a trance at Jerusalem and admitted he had no influence or power to influence the 12 apostles to accept Paul and so on. So I kind of left it so that the one of the heaviest hitting weapons in this issue or on this issue is the fact that Paul and Jesus contradict. Now, I want to say that I'm not going to give you a lot of them right now. This had been for years the most popular article on the website. These words only, and we're going to give you a link to this later. But so I think it deserves a series all by itself. So we would cover all the contradictions in some detail. Right now, I'm going to give a kind of a cursory overlook and point out maybe a couple of them that might be very important or the best. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down over this so that you can see the different contradictions. Jesus says you're not to eat meat sacrificed to idols, but Paul says it's okay. We've covered that in other episodes. So Paul says it's okay in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 10. It doesn't violate. The only reason you don't do it is you don't want to do it in front of someone who thinks it's wrong and they're weak-minded. You have the stronger mind. You can resist eating the meat in that context because you don't want to encourage someone to violate their own conscience. But otherwise, it's totally fine. You can eat whatever you want. But Jesus said no twice in the book of Revelations, and the apostles said it 3 times. No. Paul says Jesus says the law continues, but Paul says no. A big contradiction. I mean, they could not be more far apart about anything than that. But you know what? That may not be our main focus here today. That deserves a long discussion. Paul says the Pharisees followed the law rigorously, but Jesus says they were very lax about the law. Now, that's another one which could be very helpful for you to know, is Jesus says they are very lax about teaching the law. They don't teach, they neglect the more important matters of the law of mercy, justice, judgments, the rights, the rules of right and wrong, and they don't teach pistis, which is kind of interesting. Does he mean obedience or faith? And I would contend he means obedience. Anyway, number 4 on our list here, Jesus says salvation initiates and continues by repentance from sin and obedience besides faith. Paul says this is heresy. I think we've discussed that, but that also requires a lot of theological digging around, so we're not going to cover that today. Jesus tells apostles to teach his commands given prior to his ascension while in the flesh, but Paul says not to do so. This is the dispensational argument that 2 Corinthians 5:13 says, we once knew Jesus in the flesh, but now we know him no longer. Jesus, when he ascended, said, you know what, I'm going to the Father, teach all nations to obey my commandments. So when he left, he intended that to continue. But according to Paul, according to the reading of Bultmann and Schweitzer, Paul, once Paul came around, he tells us that no, we're no longer to know the Jesus in the flesh. So those commandments don't have to be given to the nations. We can just disregard them and look to Paul and see what he says we should do. So we don't really need to get that. That's very simple as well. Paul says elders are entitled to pay for preaching and teaching, but Jesus says no. We've already kind of covered that. Paul demands it based on a passage about an ox. He claims it has altogether nothing to do with the ox and only has to do with the pastors having a right to pay. Jesus says, freely you gave, freely you give. Therefore, you're not supposed to take any money. But it never seems to make any effect. They can read it and they don't do anything about it. You can go work in a person's house and the worker is worthy of his wage. That's called the law of hospitality. You ask to be a guest for a little while. If you do a lot of work around the house, you can even get paid. And that's a way to survive and preach the gospel by using the law of hospitality, but not to take pay to preach or teach. But that takes a lot of time too. Jesus teaches there are only 12 apostles into eternity, but Paul adds himself to the list as the 13th. That seems pretty obvious, so I don't think we need to go there. Paul exhorts celibacy, but Jesus clearly says it's a choice not within everyone's power. It's not something that usually comes up, so I don't think it's an important one for me to bring up here. Jesus says there is one pastor and teacher himself, but Paul tells the church he is a teacher, and there are many pastors and teachers. Now, that might be one that'd be fun to look at. We'll see. This is one I'm thinking of. But Paul says God is dead, the God of the dead. Paul says God is the God of the dead, but Jesus says God is not the God of the dead. So I find that when things are verbally, unquestionably in contradiction, I find those are interesting. So let's pause and just take a look at that one. All right. So here's two statements that cannot be reconciled, and that's why I like little pithy things you can just show people. This is to help you if you're on the fence. It also is helpful to have these in your pocket. So Paul speaks of the Lord of the dead and the living, Romans 14:9. But Jesus said God is not the God of the dead, but the living. See, that's interesting. So that's Luke 20, verse 38. So that's a clear inconsistency between the two of them. I like those kind of things. They're very interesting. Okay, so that's enough of that. Now here's a contradiction that's explicit on its face and is yet very also significant. Paul says God does not live in temples made of human hands, but Jesus says he does. And this is unquestionable. I don't know how anybody gets around this one. Paul says, quote, God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. Acts 17:24 in the Greek there is karapoietoi, handmade. However, Jesus said in a correction of the Pharisees who thought an oath offered by articles offered at the temple were binding, but not an oath by the temple at Jerusalem itself. And Jesus said this, and he who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. So there is a God who dwells in a temple, and that's Matthew 23:21. Now, you know that without having to cite a verse. But also, Jesus elsewhere actually referred to the temple of Jerusalem as a temple made with hands, the same Greek word as it was in Acts 17:24. This is in Mark 14, verse 58, and the Greek word there is karapoietoin, which is just simply a slight change in case. So, hence, Jesus clearly said God dwells at the temple made of human hands. Paul quite clearly says the opposite as a principle true at all times. The importance of this is that Jesus affirms God does live in a temple made of human hands, but Paul says it's untrue. Okay, so that's a clear-cut contradiction, right? And Paul doesn't even have, and now think about this. Paul's conception is completely unbiblical. It's anti-biblical because God has dwelled in that temple since the first temple back. Even in the crossing in Exodus, there was a special tabernacle for God, so they would move. It was a movable tabernacle, and then later they had a temple, and that was destroyed, and then they had this next temple, and that was destroyed in 70 A.D. And so now we don't have that temple anymore, but that was only since 70 A.D. It didn't exist. But Paul was speaking in Acts while the temple was still there, because we see later in Acts in 21 he goes into the temple and his companion defiles it. Trophimus defiles it by going into the sacred area of the temple uncircumcised. Okay, so I think that's a very conclusive one. So we've got two simple ones, not going to take long to describe them. Okay, so we're going to look at both Jesus's and Paul's view on whether the ruling authorities, the governments, the kingships or the democracies or whatever they are they under the authority of Satan or are they under the authority of God? You'd think you know this answer. Well, it's very clear who Paul thinks is in charge. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. So he's saying all the authorities on earth have been established by God. The authorities that exist have been established by God. He then says so. Again, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. So he's also saying established, instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. And then he says, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. He must live in another planet. A lot of governments actually are the wrong, and they are instituting wrong, and they mandate wrong. So he lives on a different planet than the rest of us, If you are in a virtuous country, which there are a few, you wouldn't find this anomaly to be true. I would only say this. I find people who exercise the role of judge tend to be truly seeking good, and they have a selfless motive, and they're usually servants. So I just want to make that clear. There are exceptions to the rule, but most government people are out for power, and whatever gives them the power, they're going to say and do whatever they need for power, and more money and more power, and so on. But a judge just has power already, can make rules and decisions, and the judge doesn't need to go beyond that. So I kind of have a respect for judges that I do not have for politicians. Okay, do what is then do what is right, and he will commend you. That not necessarily so. You could do all the right things, but politicians will go against you if it's more political to go to oppose you. So even if you're doing right, they'll take the opposite position if it's more advantageous to themselves. I think if we listen to the news, it's always frustrating if you're following one angle of a story and you're wondering, hey, why are the bad people not winning? The bad people don't win because the government isn't always on the side of goodness. It wants you to think it is always on the side of goodness, but it isn't always on the side of goodness. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. So that implies when he bears the sword, you must submit or not resist, particularly even if it's wrong, even if they're persecuting people for the wrong thing. I mean, there's lots of examples just in the racial discrimination that went on in our country for over 100 years. With this attitude, you would do nothing. You would never seek to reform the country. And just so you know, the Bible was against what's called involuntary servitude. Now, you could become a voluntary slave. You owe a big debt. You could become someone's servant, but it's really more of a servant who, yes, is a slave in the sense they have to stay in your house and take care of all your bidding. But I mean, they're still free to come and go. But they're not people who were robbed from their home in Africa and drawn over here to do some white man's job. If you submit as a wage slave, or excuse me, a debtor's slave, they call that debt slavery. That's different. You pay off your debt through your labor. That's a reasonable, just kind of sentence people are given or used to be given in the old days. But being stolen from your home and kidnapped, that's completely violative of the Bible. So we had a whole system based on a violation of God's word, and it was part of our government. And it would have continued of our government unless 500,000 people died to stop it. A large pouring of blood to just, stop this injustice. And Lincoln stood up for right, and he got shot in the head. So you can't say it's always going to work out when you resist evil. But in a sense, Lincoln was a resistor of a government that was all around him. All the politicians he was dealing with in Congress were mostly in favor of slavery. And so he was trying to convince them morally to switch. So this was a huge battle. So don't tell Americans of all people can't have this belief that government is always ordained by God, because that government ruling that way was wrong. Okay. And it's not that they wanted. I'm not saying the founders were wrong. I'm saying this institution is what was wrong, and it was endorsed and maintained by government, and was eventually defended by government. And then there were all kinds of laws against interfering with slaves and returning. You had to return a slave, and all these different things. So you can't believe that all government is good and wholesome. It can be very bad. Okay, so let's see, what does Jesus teach? The opposite. And what's so interesting is how often Jesus teaches the opposite. The kings of the... so first of all, let's look at a couple of other things. Psalm 2:2. The kings of the earth... Oh, this is important because this is a passage about the Messiah. And this says the enemies, who the enemies of Messiah are. Listen, is the kings of the earth, are those his friends or his enemies? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his Messiah. Psalm 2:2. So that's why Jesus is going to have a totally different view of them. And the devil takes him into an exceeding high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world. This is the devil trying to tempt Jesus. And the glory of them. And says unto him, all these things will I give you if you will fall down and worship me. Now, I'm just presuming, but Satan wouldn't be offering this to him unless he knew he could give it to him. The authority over all nations. And by the way, then Jesus wouldn't have to die. He could tell Pilate where to go, right? But he's not. He's going to resist the temptation, right? Then says Jesus unto him, Get you hence, Satan. Get away, basically. Get away, Satan. For it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. So that's an implication that Satan is in control of the governments of the world. Then Jesus refers specifically three times, that the ruler or prince of this world is Satan. And he says this in John. So this is not a synoptic parallel reason why it's being repeated. It's three different times. John 12, verse 31, John 14, verse 30, John 16, verse 11, and here they all are. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. John 12, 31. Next, hereafter I will not talk much with you, for the prince of this world comes and has nothing in me. John 14, verse 30. Of judgment, because the prince of this world is judged. John 16, 11. In John 18, 36, Jesus says something similar. He says, his kingdom is not of this world. So he says, Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. So he is clearly disjoining himself from the governments of this world. Okay, and then this is sort of the same thing. 1 John 5:19, Apostle John writes, The whole world lies in the evil one. That could be understood as the government of the whole world lies in the evil one. So Paul's saying the opposite is a contradiction, because he's saying they're agents of God. And I just want you to see a couple of other things before I change. And you know what? I'm going to take a pause right here, and we'll pick up on these study notes, what's interesting in them. Okay, so the notes actually point to us to contradictions between Paul and Peter and John, and presumably Peter and John are learning from Jesus, and so their application of what he's saying would actually explain why there's this conflict. So in other words, let's look at the conflict between Paul and them, and we'll see a conflict between Paul and Jesus. So Peter and John, when they first were told not to preach by the legal authorities at Jerusalem, they responded in Acts 4:19. But Peter and John replied, Which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. So they're saying, we're going to listen to God. We're not going to listen to you, the authorities, the legal authorities in this situation. The same happened again in Acts 5, verse 29, and they responded again similarly, for, quote, Peter and the other apostles replied, We must obey God rather than human beings. So you can see they believe that just because a legal authority, a government agency, the Sanhedrin is that kind of authority in even Jerusalem under Roman auspices, even the authorities of the Jews had their own jurisdiction. So they're saying we don't have to obey you to shut up or not preach the gospel of what we understand Jesus is saying. So now Paul would contradict that. He would say, these are the constituted authorities. They're there to protect you, blah, blah, blah. And he is completely inconsistent with Peter and John and Peter are consistent with Jesus. Another example that proves that you can't just follow whatever the governing authorities say is exemplified in the life of Daniel. So I think he was one of the Magi. He was one of the leaders who was, he was kidnapped from Jerusalem, brought as an educated young man to Babylon, and he was getting very influential because he was doing such a good job, and the king liked him a lot. And some other lower officials decided to set him up by getting a law passed by the king's authority that anybody who doesn't worship the king of Babylon as God or the gods of Babylon would be subject to arrest, death penalty. Okay, so but this was all intended to catch Daniel. So these men spied him out, found out he's still praying 3 times a day to his God Yahweh, violating this law. And so they go to the king, and here's what happens. This is in Daniel 6:13. Then they answered and spoke before the king of Babylon. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Daniel 6:13. So he ends up getting thrown into the lion's den because of this. So we learn a lesson there. You cannot treat the government as always an agency of good. This was a law corruptly obtained for improper purpose. Okay, so laws can be made illegally. Just like in our country, there are unconstitutional laws that have illegal purposes, and so the Constitution is a barrier to that kind of activity. So you can't just say, as a matter of law, that all laws are given by God and by basically whatever they say is authorized. You have to just follow what the law says, as Paul was teaching, as if it's as equal to God's own word. Another example of where disobeying law was very much approvingly rewarded, let's put it that way. Also, because Moses, if you remember, Moses was a little baby, and there was an order at the time he was born that all the Hebrew babies should be killed, and his life was spared because his mother put him in a little cradle and put him in the water and just floated him downstream. And lo and behold, it ended up near the Pharaoh's house, and one of the women connected with Pharaoh's house took Moses in, gave him the name Moses, which is actually an Egyptian name, and they raised him as one of the Pharaoh's sons. But for that, we would never have Moses, and who knows how history would have been different. So that's Exodus 1:17, by the way. So laws are not always good. Laws can be criminal and cruel. Killing babies like that is terrible. So and so it said here, but the midwives feared God. So fearing God will make you not comply with the law. You want to do the right thing, and the law is telling you to do something evil. See? So it's not always true. And the Bible gives you plenty of examples contrary to what Paul was teaching. So they did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So Paul is false, clearly, biblically false. And so he contradicts Jesus, he contradicts Peter and John, he contradicts the examples of Daniel, he contradicts the example of Moses' life. He just does not seem to know the Bible very well. Now, Thomas Aquinas actually kind of did a little thoughtful recollection on this, and I just want to give some acknowledgement to him. I remember when I was a young high schooler, I did like Thomas Aquinas. He was thoughtful. Anyway, he recognized the Christian had no duty to obey unjust laws, implicitly recognizing that the world rulers are not God's agents. So we're able to look at them and say, this law is unjust. We don't have to follow it. It's not directly from God. Completely, that's a completely baseless thing. But if you believe what Paul is saying, you could never you could never say the law is unjust because it's given by God. It was established by God. So Paul's whole foundational theory is completely wrong. Okay, anyway, so we have established this was clearly false by Paul. All right, I don't know that I have anything else. I'm going to pause it for a second here. For part A, so this will be 7A, and I'm going to make a 7B because it looks like I created 20 more minutes after this, and I think it's just easier. So you've had 25 minutes, and I'm trying to keep these bite-sized so that you can have it during a short period or lunchtime. And I hope this is helping people to have it shorter. I've been doing that as much as I can due to popular request. So anyway, we'll be back with a little bit more of the contradictions between Paul and Jesus in the next episode.